Good evening, everyone, and welcome to yet again another one of the AHS's seminar series. So tonight we have James Van Dyke, or Van, who is a senior lecturer in Biomedical Sciences at the Trobe University. Van's research broadly looks at concepts such as reproduction in reptiles as well as other vertebrates, as well as the evolution of vivipary. So Van's academic career began in the US, where he completed his PhD looking at a number of sort of evolutionary and physiological questions, I should say, in species such as smooth-shell turtles, black rat snakes. He also did some work on timber rattlesnakes over there. After completing that and some work on some subsequent postdoctoral work, he then ended up coming to Australia, where he worked in Michael Thompson's lab at the University of Sydney, looking at questions around the evolution of vivipary on species within the Pseudomoea genus. From there, he then went across to work with Ricky Spencer at Western Sydney Uni and began doing, I guess, a deeper foray into a lot of his turtle conservation, which does kind of lead into today's presentation. So Van's work today that he'll be presenting is about his research in the Murray, or I should say the Murray River system, and some of the work that he's completed looking at turtles.
Hi, everybody, and thanks to the Australian Herp Society for having me to do this long distance presentation like this. I'm sorry I can't get up to Sydney to do it given all the COVID stuff, but it's good to kind of virtually see all of you again. So today I'm going to be talking about some work that I've been doing on turtle conservation in the Murray River. Some of you may have seen a little bit of what I'm going to talk about here before, but hopefully I've got enough new stuff that you won't be completely bored out of your minds. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge the Wiradjuri people, because I'm in Albury right now and presenting from their traditional lands. So I'd like to pay my respects to them and their elders, past, present, and emerging. I also like to start off my presentations acknowledging all the people that have contributed to the work that I present. I'm just going to move this down a little bit so that we can see all of the different people here. So just a heap of people have contributed to the work that I'm going to present today. Ricky Spencer, a lot of students. Robin Watts has led the project that I'll talk about in the Edward system. The Edward River system, and we've been supported by a lot of additional groups. And I really want to thank these guys from the Yakua Indigenous Knowledge Center, Joe, Letitia, Tracy. They've helped me with a lot of the work that I'm going to be talking about in Deniliquin towards the end of this talk. So with that, I will move on to the story. And oops, there we go. Sorry, I just lost my place. There we go. So we've got 3 species of turtles in the Murray River system. You're probably familiar with some of this, but if not, I just wanted to go through a little bit of the basics. We've got the eastern long-necked turtle, sometimes called the snake-necked turtle, sometimes called a tortoise because they sometimes walk on land. Either name's fine. I don't really mind either way. This is the one that you're probably most familiar with in most of Australia. They have a very broad distribution. They can survive away from water for quite a long time, and they will migrate in between wetlands. They really like kind of ephemeral, temporary wetlands. People find them in farm dams a lot, and we often see them crossing or getting smashed on roads. They're also the stinky ones that when people pick up, they say, oh, it peed on me and it stank. Well, it's not really the pee, it's the musk that stinks. And they're really interesting because they're a highly carnivorous turtle. They eat a lot of aquatic insects, a lot of aquatic invertebrates. So pretty much anything from mosquito larvae all the way up to small yabbies and some small fish as well. They love tadpoles too. So they're quite generalist carnivores. We've got the Murray River short-necked turtle, or Emydura macquarei, and this is probably our second most widespread species. It's usually the most common one we have in more permanent water, any kind of wetlands connected or disconnected to the main channels. We typically find a lot of Murray short-necked turtles. They very rarely come out on land. They will sometimes if it's a short distance, and to nest, of course, but usually they're swimming in the water, and that'll be important when I talk about one of my later projects towards the end of this. We often see them basking on logs, particularly in the spring and autumn. They're highly generalist. They eat everything from green algae up to decaying animals, which is really important. and they'll eat pretty much anything they can catch. But the thing that we found is that they eat a lot of filamentous green algae. They'll also eat a fair amount of other aquatic plants. And these are listed as vulnerable in Victoria and South Australia. And the third species is the broad-shell turtle. This is our biggest and rarest turtle. It's the biggest freshwater turtle species in Australia, I'm pretty sure. So we've caught females of this species up to almost 7 kilos at times. And that's the full body, when you add the shell and the neck together, is about 1 meter long at that point. So we're talking a pretty big turtle. They prefer permanent water again, so you find them in kind of the main channels of the rivers and some of your more permanent and bigger wetlands. They'll go into temporary wetlands sometimes, but just not as much. They're highly carnivorous, still a bit generalist, but they're mainly eating bigger prey, so things like crayfish, yabbies, and small fish. One of the things that makes them interesting is they nest in autumn. So the other two species nest in the spring, the broadshells nest in autumn, and their eggs actually stay in a state of diapause through winter, and they don't fully really switch on development until spring starts. So the eggs all the way to hatching might stay in the nest up to an entire year. So they're really kind of different in that way. And they're listed as endangered in Victoria and South Australia. So one of the things that I try to get across to people who are not into turtles or into herps is, why do turtles matter? And one of the things that we found recently, this is work by Claudia Santori, one of our PhD students who just finished, is they historically ate hundreds of thousands of tons of carcasses each year. So they're really important for eating dead stuff in the water. So especially if you have something like a fish kill, turtles are one of your primary scavenging species. And Claudia did a really nice project showing that turtles were the main scavengers at a few sites in South Australia. And then she also did a nice project showing that their scavenging in these mesocosm environments actually improved or helped maintain water quality if you put a dead carp in. So this is putting dead carp in ponds with turtles, and you can see that just the quality, just looking at it, you don't have as much of an algal bloom because turtles are there to eat those dead fish. Whereas if you let that carp just kind of rot on its own, it takes a lot longer, and you see that it takes even longer for the water to kind of return to normal. So the water returns to normal with turtles after less than a week, whereas without turtles, you're looking at potentially up to a month that it took that water to get back to normal. Move my image around a little bit. So major turtle declines were first really identified in this paper by Bruce Chessman. It was also acknowledged or noticed by the Ngarrindjeri people in South Australia. They just weren't seeing as many turtles as they had before. So they kind of got this idea started, and Bruce's paper was really important in 2011 because he compared sites that he'd worked on in the 1970s to then sites that he worked on just after the millennium drought around 2009 and 10, I think it was. And he found 91% declines of the eastern longnecks at these sites, 67% declines at the Murray shortneck, and no decline in the broadshell, but they were always rare to start with. And I just want to emphasize that these are estimates from only one area near Wodonga, so kind of on the mid-upper Murray river system. So one of the things that I did a few years ago in working with Bruce and Ricky and a few other folks is asking, how bad is this situation across the broader river catchment? So I sampled over 50 sites across the southern Murray in 2015 to 2017. So that's indicated by all these red dots from way up on the Murray and the kind of higher country all the way down to South Australia. And at a number of those upper sites, we didn't actually catch many turtles. It was probably too cold for them to begin with, so that's why they're not on this graph. But this graph is showing basically our catch per unit effort, so our numbers of turtles per trap per hour, going from the highest upstream points that we sampled all the way down to the lowest downstream points. So this is close to the ocean, and this is further up the Murray. And what you can see here is that our short-necked turtles and our long-necked turtles in particular go down as you go downstream. So we have a fairly large number of them in some of our upstream sites. And once we get down here, so this is basically the border between Victoria, New South Wales, and South Australia. Once we get into South Australia, we have very, very low numbers, including a few zeros, which is pretty bad. So at most of these sites, we're putting 5 to 10 traps out at a time. We're trapping for 3 to 4 days, and we're not catching any turtles over that time period. Whereas in most of our upstream sites, if we do that, you might catch anywhere from 30 to 60, maybe 100 turtles over that time period at one of these sites. So that's kind of giving you an idea of what these different numbers might represent. So people sometimes, you see a lot of turtles, especially when they're basking, so we tend to think that their population's okay. So I just want to kind of put this in terms. Historically, from Mike Thompson's work, there was we think as many as 115 turtles per hectare. And a hectare is 100 meters by 100 meters square, and that would look something like this. So that's a lot of turtles in a pretty small area, a really dense population. And the biomass of this is getting close to the biomass of things like big herbivores on the Serengeti. So this is a lot of animal material as turtles here. And to put that in other terms, the Sydney Cricket Ground is about a 2.2 hectare space. So you'd have, using this estimate, about 250 turtles in that kind of a space. So if we think about that now, if we look at Bruce's numbers and assume like a best case 50% decline across all 3 species, kind of averaging across the 3, it would look something like this. So this is going from 115 per hectare to 60, almost 60 turtles per hectare. So we're getting about a 50% decline. If we compare that to our worst case, so this might be places where I didn't catch any turtles in my project, there's probably a few there, but there weren't enough to actually measure them because they didn't enter the traps. Maybe they're more spread out. So there might be a few there, but there's just not nearly as many as we used to have. So you might ask why they're in such bad shape in South Australia, and Mike Thompson did a fair amount of this kind of early preliminary work that he noticed in the 80s, and he found very few juveniles in the river in those earlier projects. He was still catching seeing relatively large numbers of adults. And he blamed the invasive red foxes because he was also finding really high rates of nest destruction. So about 95% of all turtle nests he was finding were being eaten by foxes. And what we think happens is that if you have this really, really high rate of nest destruction, there's no juveniles entering the river system. And as old adults age and they die of old age or they die of other causes, they're simply just not being replaced. So it's kind of a long-term attrition that's driving these populations to extinction. And we're now starting to see the same pattern in the Upper Murray where turtles are relatively common. So this is looking at Bruce's work again. So this is one of his graphs. And here he's looking at the proportions of populations at different body sizes. So this is bigger turtles, this is smaller turtles. And what he found was that basically all of the juvenile turtles that he was catching early on, so in the 70s, that whole size class is basically gone from his sites. And they're only adults, big adult turtles at his sites. And this is something that I saw throughout the Upper Murray as well. So even where I was catching large numbers of turtles, the populations were being dominated for the most part by old adults. So for example, in the Gunbower region, which is near Chuka, we've captured and marked over 300 individual turtles, and fewer than 20 of those were juveniles. So less than 10% of the population is down in this juvenile size range. And even more than that, a larger percentage, around 50% or more, are on the upper end of the adult size. So we're talking mainly bigger, older adults that may be at risk of dying of older age. So South Australia might be showing us kind of the current situation in South Australia, may be showing us the future of the upstream turtles. So where I'm in Albury right now, if I go down to some of the local wetlands, on a good day, you might see a heap of turtles there, but they're all large adults that you can see. And so when they start dying of old age, then there's a good chance that there's not going to be juveniles to replace them. And this can lead to very fast extinctions, especially if we have adults getting killed by other things like getting hit on roads and things like that, which is something I'll talk about here in a minute. So as I mentioned, foxes in some places are destroying 95%, sometimes up to 100% of nests within a year. We've done some projects using artificial nests and putting camera traps on them, and we found that foxes, they find the nest rapidly, sometimes within 24 hours. We've had a single fox destroy 15 nests in just 5 hours, as an example. They don't necessarily eat all the eggs right away, but they probably cache them. And even if they don't take all of the eggs away, let's say they dig up a nest partially and leave some of the eggs, those eggs are then much more exposed to the environment. So they're going to get too hot, they might get too cold, too dry, too wet, and they probably aren't going to hatch anyway. Now, the interesting thing about turtles is they can actually handle this for quite a while. Their natural egg and hatchling survival is probably very low to begin with. Could be on the order of something like 5 to 10%. With foxes, maybe this is less than 1%. But once they get to the water, we think that their survivorship should increase. There's fewer predators that we know about, at least in the river systems, and so they should have fairly high survival. Once they reach kind of a moderate size, there aren't very many things that can actually eat them, at least in the water. When they come out on land, foxes will still get them. But what this means is that they have potential to survive this kind of high rate of egg and nest mortality. The other thing is that the adult turtles, they might live 50 plus years. We don't really know. And the females are likely reproducing every single year, and each year they're producing at least 20 eggs. And so let's assume they have a 50-year adult lifespan and they produce 20 eggs at a time. That's 1,000 eggs that a single female is producing. And at least to maintain a baseline population, she only needs to have 2 of those actually survive to adulthood. So there's a good chance that they could survive even relatively high nest predation rates. And even if they can't survive, even if one nest gets destroyed in 1 year, just one good year in 10 might be enough to maintain a population. The problem is when you add additional sources of adult mortality in particular. So let's say like road mortality. So this is modeling work that Ricky led in a paper that we published in 2017. And this top line is basically assuming our natural system. So this is without foxes, without roads, etc. So starting with a population of 1,000, we're getting just random ups and downs, but it's never really crashing. It's not increasing over time. It's just kind of staying steady. If we add 95% nest destruction by foxes, then that survival rate declines, but it doesn't quite go away. It's still there. We still have turtles, but we're basically going from 1,000 to maybe a population of 200. And then if we add just 2% of adult mortality via something like roadkill, that's when we have a big crash. And within 100 years, we were going from 1,000 to 0 turtles. So adding those two things together is really bad. Now, we've done a lot of experimentation with different methods of fox management to protect nests. There's some normal 1080 baiting projects that we've done, and this has reduced fox numbers, but it's had no impact on nest destruction. We've had some shooting and in some sites, and that just didn't work at all. Didn't reduce fox numbers at all. And then Katie Howard in her PhD has done some high intensity 1080 baiting, and that does seem to have had some success. So this is basically doubling or even potentially quadrupling the number of baits out there, and just really keeping baits out there all the time. And this might have some success at knocking back enough foxes to protect some nests. The problem with it is it's pretty expensive, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, you might ask why lethal methods are not always effective. And one of the things is that we expect a linear density dependent response. So let's say we have a fox population size going from 100% down to 0. We expect that if we knock that fox population back by 20% here to 0.8, we should see a corresponding decrease in the nest destruction rate. So you take away some number of the population, that should save the corresponding percentage of nests. This is what we kind of mentally, intuitively expect, and it's just not the case. And this is the thing that's really hard to explain to most people, because most people just don't get it. Where we've actually studied this, so this is where we've been using 1080 baiting or shooting or whatever to reduce fox activity. So this is basically saying some index of fox activity that we're picking up with remote cameras, we're reducing that down to 0. And this is nest predation rate. And basically what we see is nest predation rate stays close to that 95% rate until you get foxes down to 0. So you have to get every single fox in order for lethal controls to work. That's what our data indicate. And that's to get any kind of reduction in nest destruction rate. You have to get these foxes down to 0. And that's basically a quick shift from 95% to 0 right away. And this is really hard to do on a landscape scale. Surviving foxes will have more kits after culls and poisoning, which will hasten their recovery. And this is just because there's more food available, so a female can produce more offspring. New foxes will colonize areas after culls and poisoning pretty quickly, so that can lead to recovery. And these two things mean that we need lethal controls to be widespread and regular to eradicate foxes. And I'm working with Murray Local Land Services to test some of these in Deniliquin. So it's basically taking the work that Katie's done and trying to see if we can, on a multi-year scale, actually protect some sites and get some hatchling turtles back into those systems. But it's a pretty expensive thing to do. So there are some other ways that we might be able to protect turtle nests. And one of the things that Ricky and I have been working on trying to get funding for is a head starting approach. So this is where we would incubate eggs and release hatchlings, or maybe not even incubate eggs, but protect eggs in place, do a better job of finding ways to protect a lot of nests in a suitable beach, and just stopping foxes from getting to them so that we can then release hatchlings. And the benefit of this approach is that it removes the eggs from the foxes. So we're not controlling foxes, but we're protecting the eggs themselves. And the idea here is that if we can just boost the numbers of juveniles just enough to replace old adults, then hopefully we can stop some of the declines in some locations. And it's kind of a similar idea to fisheries stocking. If you read about head starting, kind of the standard way is, you put out a few head started animals and you invest a lot in each particular animal. And our approach is different from that. What we want to do is just get as many babies out as possible and just kind of flood the system, similar to how fisheries stocking works. So get a lot of juveniles out inexpensively, knowing that their individual survival rate probably isn't going to be all that great, but just getting them out there is replacing the babies that are getting killed in the nests. And one of the nice things about doing this is that if we can get the funding to do it, it'll test the fox hypothesis. So if we think foxes are the main driver of turtle declines, doing this will actually test that. And that will enable us to move forward as well. So based on our modeling, we think that this should work. So this is the same kind of graph I was showing before. And what we've done here is we've just added the head started population, or we've added some head starting to the plus 95 and plus 2% mortality, and that brings us back up to normal. And this is supplementing with 30% of the female population per year. And of a population of 1,000 turtles, this works out to only about 8 clutches for a population of 1,000. And just to give you the math on that, if we assume 50-50 sex ratio, that's 500 females. 500 times 0.3, which is our 30%, gives us 150 females. And 150 divided by 20 eggs, so that's 20 eggs per clutch, gives us 7.5 clutches. So that's all we need to actually maintain a population of 1,000. So it should be doable and not terribly difficult either. So one of the things that we're working on is just the logistics, how do we actually do this? And there's a turtle breeder in South Australia that had some interesting ideas about this. So he has a sprinkler system that he switches on, and that gets the turtles to come out to nest. So they seem to nest in response to rain events. So that's something that you might be able to do at a wetland, encourage turtles to come out and nest because they think it's raining. You can then find the turtles as they're nesting and protect their nests as soon as they finish. And then after they incubate, they also tend to emerge in response to rain. So then you could kind of target going out to find some hatchlings and then move them directly to the water. Possibly, if you get the permits, move them to other sites. So this is just kind of the basics of how we could go about doing this kind of thing. And I'm going to plug Turtlestat quite a lot. You probably heard about it before, but Turtlestat is the program that Ricky has set up. It's a mobile phone app that you can enter any turtle sightings. So if you see a turtle or a turtle nest, please go ahead and upload it to Turtlestat. We really appreciate that. We've just put in a citizen science grant with the Australian government, so we're trying to expand this and improve it. So hopefully if that grant gets funded, I might have more to come in and talk about with this and encourage some of you to become more actively involved, hopefully. The other thing that you can do is protect turtle nests. So this is a nest that's been dug up. You can see the scattered eggshells. And if you see a big hole in the ground with eggshells scattered around like this, it's probably a turtle nest. In the Sydney area, it could possibly also be a water dragon nest, but usually the nest hole won't be quite so big and there won't be as many eggshells. The eggshells are hard when they're first laid, but after they've been destroyed like this, they tend to shrivel up and curl up like this. So you can't always tell if it was a hard-shelled egg or a flexible shelled egg after they've been destroyed. We work a lot with the group Turtles Australia, which is based in Melbourne, and they've developed some really nice nest protection kits. They're really inexpensive. They've got a great procedure on their website of how to do this. So if you see a turtle nesting, yeah, you do have to kind of give them their space. If you disturb a turtle before they've actually started laying their eggs, they'll probably abandon the nest. If they've started laying, as soon as they finish laying, they'll leave. And when they leave, you just go back to that spot and you put this mesh down. And the mesh that Turtles Australia recommends is big enough that the hatchlings can dig their way out when they actually hatch. So this is something that pretty much anybody can do. It's really easy, really straightforward, really inexpensive. The only really hard part about it is finding the turtles in the process of nesting and finding the nest before foxes do. But this is pretty straightforward to do. And if anybody has any questions about how to do this, please let me know. I'm always happy to help out. So I just want to talk about some of the more recent stuff that I've been doing on the Edward College River system. So this is in New South Wales. We've got our little box here in the map, and this is in the Edward River just near Deniliquin. And this is a bigger project that's looking at optimizing environmental flows, basically how to do environmental flows in this system. And I mentioned Robin Watts at Charles Sturt University. She's leading this project, and we're looking at turtles, we're looking at plants, we're looking at fish, we're looking at all kinds of stuff. And I've just gotten permission to talk about some of the turtle work that I've been doing here. And one of the issues that we set out to test is that some wetlands in this region dry in the winter. And if there's turtles in those wetlands when they dry, this might really literally hang them out to dry. So they're ectotherms. In the wintertime, it's cold. If the water suddenly dries up around them, they're not going to be able to escape that. They're not going to be very able to protect themselves from predators or get to the river just because they're going to be too cold to do very much. And so winter environmental flows might help rescue these turtles. The other possibility is that turtles might avoid these conditions by leaving their wetlands before winter. And so I just want to talk about a project that we did to test some of this. So this is another map just looking at the system. So this is the Edward River going up like that. Here's Deniliquin. And we put out, with the help of New South Wales Fisheries DPI, we've put out 24 acoustic receivers at 6 wetlands. So there's 2 wetlands here, 1 there, and these 2 here. So we've put acoustic receivers inside the wetlands and some in the river just outside. So we can track turtles basically as they're in the wetlands and as they go in and out. We've got different types of wetlands. So we've got some that are permanent, like this one here. So this is a big one that you can see has a nice permanent connection to the Edward River. And then we've got some that are temporary, like this one. So this one has a little channel that basically when the river's up, it'll get water that flows in, but it has a tendency to dry out. So we've got some connected wetlands, we've got some disconnected wetlands, and we've got some semi-connected wetlands. We deployed last year 24 acoustic tags. So we started in October of 2019, and by February of 2020, we'd gotten them all out. We tried to get 12 males and 12 females, and we tried to get 2 each at each of our wetlands. So that's 4 turtles at all 6 wetlands, split equally between males and females. There was one site, I think we only got 3 males, and another, so we just put that tag elsewhere. And it was just based on how many turtles we were catching. So we attach these to the back of the carapace. The battery lasts about a year, and so we can track those turtles as long as they're within 200 meters of any of those acoustic receiver locations. Over the past couple of months, or I guess throughout the project, we've been also trapping each of the sites. So in the spring and autumn of each year, and over those different captures, I think we've caught, I don't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but it's around 300 each of their short neck and long neck turtles and about 150, 200 of the broad shells. And we've recaptured 3 of our tag turtles over this period, and the tags look good. They aren't causing them any health problems or anything like that. So it's been really good to see. And just some of our preliminary tracking data, I just want to show you. So we're still collecting data right now. We will be until February. So in February, I'm going to go back out and pull all these receivers out and do another round of trapping. Here's one of our sites. This is Municola Lagoon, and it's got a receiver outside the lagoon in the river here and one here. So these are to measure if turtles go up or downstream if they leave. And then it has 4 inside the lagoon. Each of these has a range of about 200 meters. So if a tag turtle comes within 200 meters of that receiver station, it will be picked up, it'll be pinging, and the receiver will hit it. So here we've tagged a turtle that was right here. So we released it back near this station, and it moved, it moved around the wetland. So it basically made a whole circle around that wetland. And this was as of last autumn, it had done that. Some of our turtles moved in and out, so they might move into the river, they might move back in, but it just gives you an idea of how this system works. So a quick summary of our tracking results. Our wetland type did not really strongly affect our movement patterns. So remember I said we had some permanent, some temporary, and some kind of semi-attached, semi-connected wetlands. And almost all of our wetlands, the turtles behave pretty much the same, except for this one here. And what happened here was that this wetland actually started to dry up in last summer. And so between December and February, when we did our trapping there and our receiver downloads, all of our turtles left that wetland over that time period. So by February, this wetland it had less than a meter of water at its deepest location. There were no turtles in it except for one long neck turtle, which we caught, and we also recaptured that turtle this December. And so this site was the only one that did actually dry out, and it actually dried out in the summer instead of the winter. But all the turtles had pretty much left this site by February. So I just got the arrow pointing at that location. We didn't have any sites dry out over the winter, so we didn't really get a good test of our winter hypothesis. But what we did see, or I should mention that this wetland has refilled now. So we've had a lot of long neck turtles that have been in there now as of December. We caught over 100 there, so it was a really good site for long necks now. Most of our male turtles left their home wetlands soon after they were tagged. So we would catch them in a wetland, we tag them, and based on the receivers, the transmitter data, within a week or two, they would leave those wetlands and they would go into the river and they would move around the river. And some of them did some really long distance moves. So we had some that moved from these 2 wetlands all the way to here, and that's a straight line distance of over 15 kilometers. So you can think swimming up and downstream, that's a pretty long distance. We also had one go from here all the way to there. So far, we haven't had any movements between these, but we know at least that the males can do these big movements, which is really interesting. The females usually stayed at home throughout the winter or throughout the summer. So they would stay in those wetlands, the same ones that they were tagged in, basically from when they were tagged until the beginning of the 2020 winter. And interestingly, by May, all but 5 of their turtles left their home wetlands. So even the females that stayed home, by the time we reached May of 2020, all but 5 had moved into the river. And most of them stayed in the adjacent river. So if we look at this, I'll zoom in a minute. But if we look at the river just next to the wetland, they just moved there. They just gone into the river. They hadn't moved far. They had just gone away from their home wetland. And interestingly, by December, so by the time we've gotten back into the spring again, most of those turtles have then come back into the wetland. So it looks like they're moving into the river just before winter, and then they're moving back into their wetlands just as we get into spring. So I just want to give you a little bit more information here. So we've got 19 of our 24 turtles leaving their home wetlands before winter, and we think that's really important for our question. And like I said, most of them stayed in the adjacent part of the river all winter, especially our females. The males, they wandered a bit more, but if we look at these 2 wetlands, so this one here and this one here, our female turtles from these 2 sites basically just went into the river. They stayed in this little area the entire time, or if they left, they only left for a few days and then they reappeared at one of these receiver stations. So they've stayed really, really local. And then as soon as we've gotten into spring, they've moved back into those wetlands. So this looks like it could be an interesting little behavioral adaptation that basically prevent them from getting stuck in a wetland during winter. So that initial question that we had, if a wetland dries during winter, are these turtles going to be exposed, and do we need environmental water to kind of prevent that? And it looks like for the majority of our turtles, they might have this behavioral adaptation to leave those wetlands to avoid getting stuck in winter. But I do want to point out that there were 5 turtles, all females, that did stay in their home wetlands. So, and that was regardless of wetland type, except for this one here that did dry out or almost dried up before winter. So there might be a little bit more detail that we're missing here. But it looks like for the most part, they don't want to risk getting stuck in those wetlands during winter. Based on this wetland drying out, it might be that the environmental flow management might be more important in summer, especially in droughts. So last summer was a drought year. It was still pretty dry. We had really low flows, and that contributed to this site drying out. And so if we'd had some water into that wetland, potentially, that would have kept those turtles in that wetland a little bit longer. But like I said, as of now, now that it's filled back up, we've seen some of our turtles come back, and especially longnecks. Now, we didn't have longneck turtles tagged, but just through our trapping back in February of 2020, we didn't catch any turtles there except for one longneck. And then in December of 2020, we've caught over 100 there in that trap session. So the longnecks have just kind of flocked to that spot. So some future research that I've got planned, we're still in the, like I said, we've put in grants to test these best head starting approaches. So where do we get turtles? How do we best head start them? How do we incubate them to maximize their success? And are things like pollutants and pathogens a problem? One of the issues we've run into in the permitting for all this kind of work is that most of our Australian states they don't really want us moving animals around too much because of the risk of moving pathogens from one place to another. So that's kind of put a limit on whether we can move hatchlings from one wetland to another that might potentially be out of their natural range. And this is being very cautious, but given the example of the Bellinger River turtle and the Bellinger River turtle virus and that big event that killed almost all that species, it's probably worthwhile being careful. And we don't know very much at all about turtle pathogens. So this is something that one of my new PhD students, Angela Sims, is going to start working on as part of her PhD. We're also testing the effects of additional threats. So one of the things is that we've had some heat waves, and one of the things that Claudia Santori found in her PhD, she wasn't really doing this, but she had a few turtles nest at one of her sites, and some of them in a heat wave in 2019 basically all cooked. So all the eggs and hatchlings in those nests died. It was only 5 nests that she was able to look at, and not all of them did. So it's not really something we have strong data on, but the potential is there that some of our more severe heat waves could be really damaging to these. All of our turtles have genetic sex determination, so the shift in sex ratios isn't something we have to worry about. But the direct outright killing of eggs and hatchlings could be a problem. And that's something that we want to get on top of if it's going to be a continuing problem with global warming. And the last one that I'm really interested in is the importance of aquatic vegetation. This is water periwinkle, Ludwigia piploides, and turtles seem to really like this stuff, hatchling turtles in particular. And aquatic vegetation is it's non-existent in a lot of sites in the Murray. Could be because of carp, water management. There's a whole range of potential threats there. But for whatever reason, we just don't see as much vegetation as we used to. And so that could be a problem for some turtles. One of Claudia's projects that only just got published, and I wasn't able to include in this talk, she basically had some hatchling turtles that she put little radio transmitters on, and some of those hatchlings really liked this Ludwigia stuff. They went straight to it. They stayed in it the entire time that she was able to track them. So they seem to really like this kind of habitat for hiding, probably for foraging as well. They'd be full of aquatic insects, full of green algae that they'd want to eat. And that vegetation, again, is also going to be providing food. So the short-necked turtles in particular, they love the algae. They're going to be eating that stuff. There's going to be aquatic insects in there and other invertebrates. The turtles are going to be eating that stuff. And the vegetation forms the base of the food web in these systems. So the loss of this aquatic vegetation in a lot of locations could be an additional threat that we may not have been focusing enough on. We're really focusing on the fox work and protecting turtles from things like roadkills, and those are important, definitely, but these other threats might be things that we need to start thinking about, even if we get a handle on the foxes. So these are things that hopefully, if we can get the funding to do this head starting work, we'll be able to test, like putting hatchlings in sites with vegetation, without vegetation, what's their survival, what are their survival rates like, things like that. So with that, that's all I've got to present. I hope you've enjoyed it. It's certainly been a great project to do as an American coming to Australia. This is a great way to get across so much of the country and meet a lot of really cool people. Everybody I've talked to with this project has been awesome. I've gotten to meet a lot of Aboriginal Australian people. I've gotten to meet so many farmers, landowners, and everybody that I talk to has been really keen on turtles and really excited to help with this work. And that's not always the case where I come from in the States, so it's been a breath of fresh air. So with that, I'll end it. And I'm not sure how the question system works here, but if you have any questions, you want to get in touch with me, please feel free to look me up on social media or at my La Trobe email address, and I'll always be happy to talk turtles with anybody. Thanks.